Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video on Plato Symposium. Now, I'm very excited this week in particular to be able to talk about this symposium because it's a really fascinating dialogue. If you ever get like this big Plato book by Hackett, it has everything in it. In addition, all the Plato stuff, that you could want beyond what's in your textbook. And the editors of that volume claim that the symposium is Plato's, creative masterpiece. Like, kind of more than any other dialogue, the symposium sets up this sort of dramatic, sequence, and uh, people have really latched onto this aspect of the dialogue. It's also really fascinating because this dialogue, unlike many works in philosophy, treats as its central object of inquiry love, right? And it's funny because, in everyday life, like, we think about questions about love as being some of the most important questions that we can ask and answer, and like help each other out on. We think it's like really, let me get the thing correct. Yeah. We think it's very important in our everyday lives, love, right? And we see it as, some of the most important human connections that we can end up making with other people. And yet, if you look at philosophy, there's really not much that many philosophers have had to say about love, it very often leaves, I think, philosophers kind of dumbstruck, like, that they're not really supposed to figure this stuff out, but like maybe an advice columnist or something like that is supposed to figure it out, right? Um, Not Plato, right? Whereas other philosophers are maybe traditionally kind of dismissive about these questions about love, Plato thinks that questions about the nature of love are central to questions about the nature of philosophy, right? I mean, philosophy in Plato's conception is the love of wisdom, right? And what we're going to see throughout this dialogue is how seriously Plato treats that claim, right? And the symposium is really where we start to give an account of how it is that we get to the forms, right? The Apology and the Phaedo and maybe some other dialogues that we've read together, in one way or another, sort of like refer to these forms that are themselves by themselves, that they are different from the material world, that changes all the time, and they remain static and perfect and are never missing anything, right? Um, you might reasonably ask, well, like, how do we get to the forms? How do we come to, know the forms, right? And at least one answer that Plato has given in what we've discussed so far is the Meno, right? We remember the forms because our soul once communed with them, right? That's the standard Platonic answer to this question. However, you might go one step further and ask, well, what incites us to remember, right? Um, Clearly, in that passage in the Meno with the slave boy, right? It's certain kinds of probing, maybe mathematical or philosophical questions that causes the slave boy to remember. However, obviously we don't all have a Socrates to help guide us, right? And this is one of the objections that I think many students had a problem with the account of remembrance in the Meno, is that it seems like you need almost like a guide to help you remember, right? And that seems to indicate that it's not really fully from our own souls, but is in some way, related to other people as well, right? Here, in a way, Plato's going to double down on this idea, right? That you need someone else in a way to like kind of help guide you to remembrance. It of course makes sense that Plato would say this because he would think of Socrates, right, as someone who is sort of guiding him towards the forms, right? Um, But here we have a real emphasis not on any theoretical blah blah blah, but to love, genuinely love, as the motivation for developing a love of wisdom. Plato thinks that when you love someone, something in the world, if you love it really well, then what you start to discover is that you love not just this thing, right? But what this thing represents in the world, right? So like, for example, if you're a parent and you love your child, you're like, oh, I love my child. Then, you're naturally going to project outward your love not only to this one child, but all of the children that you have, right? Because you found beauty not just like in this one child in particular, but you found beauty in the experience of being a parent and having a child. And you now realize that other people have this experience of being a parent and having a child and being in love and so on, right? And so you come to value those things, not just insofar as they affect you or something like that, but you come to value them in general. And this, in general, is going to be how it is that love can lead you from the love of like particular material things in the world to ultimately, Socrates and Plato think, to a love of wisdom, right? To philosophy. Philosophy is deeply related to love, right? It's not just like this thing that like nerds do in their basement or whatever for Plato. Plato thinks that if you really, genuinely, truly love something in the world, then you will also thereby realize that that love commits you not just to this beautiful object, but to the pursuit of the beautiful in general, right? And this move from the particular earthly manifestation of beauty to loving the form of beauty, right, is exactly what it is that we kind of maybe have located as missing from Plato's account up to this point. So the Symposium is really fascinating for like a whole bunch of reasons, right? On the one hand, it seems to play this like really critical role internally to Plato's philosophical system, right? Love of wisdom is obviously critical to philosophy, right? It's what philosophy is. So in giving an account of love, Plato is also thereby giving an account of the love for wisdom exhibited in philosophy. But on the other hand, it's a very interesting dramatic piece, right? Some of these texts that we get that are really central to Plato's philosophy, it's just kind of like Socrates talking a lot, right? Like the Apology was Socrates talking a lot. The Phaedo was Socrates talking a lot. We're going to be reading the Republic together. The Republic is Socrates talking a lot, right? These are kind of characteristic of these sort of like middle dialogues, right? But here, Socrates doesn't talk that much, right? Actually, there's this whole host of people that give speeches. Now, a symposium is basically like a drinking party. That's what everyone is doing in the dialogue, right? Everyone's sitting around and drinking wine and giving speeches, attempting to praise love, right? And so Socrates' speech actually isn't until relatively late in the dialogue. He's the sixth speaker. So he's actually not the first speaker. He's not the last speaker, right? That's kind of interesting, right? And now I really want to focus on what it is that Socrates had to say in this dialogue, because it is really fascinating. But you could do a whole lot of work of examining the various speakers that go in order, right? They're chugging it up, right, and praising love. And they go one after another, after another, after another, after another, after another, and so on, right? And each of them seem to bring out one aspect of love that they in particular would like to praise, right? So Phaedrus, who actually has a dialogue named after him, he begins with the claim that like love is morally good, right? And maybe that's a little reductive for what he has to say, right? But what I think is essential about locating each of these speeches is that they say that love has some quality, right? So Phaedrus says that love is morally good. Then we get Pausanias, who talks about how love is noble, or love can be noble, or love leads to nobility. Then we get Eryximachus, who talks about how love is healthy. He talks about being a doctor a lot, right? Then we have Aristophanes, who claims that love sort of mends an original wound. It allows human beings to feel like complete in a way, right? Then Agathon, who is this younger male that Socrates is kind of like crushing on to some extent, argues that love brings happiness. And the word for happiness here is eudaimonia, which is going to be something that we discuss a lot whenever we talk a lot about Aristotle, right? And then we have Socrates, and then Alcibiades, who's also an attractive young man, describes his love for Socrates, including his sexual lust for Socrates. And he goes last, right? It's like Alcibiades' speech was, in a way, a speech in favor of Socrates, right? And that's how the dialogue concludes. But another aspect of the Symposium that's like super rich and super interesting is that Socrates' speech doesn't really come from Socrates, right? Socrates claims that he got this wisdom from this woman named Diotima, right? And so it's fascinating that, Socrates is talking about how he learned the love of wisdom, right? He's learning about love in particular, and he learns love from a woman, right? A woman is the one who teaches Socrates how to philosophize about love, right? And if we were to take this really seriously, then Diotima teaches Socrates about the nature of the forms, too, in teaching him about love. So that's really fascinating. That's really interesting, what Diotima has to say is, pretty straightforwardly the Platonic position, Plato's point of view on what love really is, right? So, really interesting choice on his part to have this wisdom come not directly from Socrates, not from some older philosopher like Parmenides or something like that, right? But from this woman, Diotima, right? Worth emphasizing also, the ancient Greeks existed in a largely misogynistic culture, right? You will have noticed that from various of the speeches, right? Women are seen as inferior love objects for men, right? Why? Well, they think that women are inferior quite generally, right? And for many of these thinkers, right, I'm thinking in particular of Pausanias, right? He really emphasizes, like, if love is noble in a certain way and it's about virtue and so on, then you should be working on the best kind of person that, you can educate or whatever, right? And so among the ancient Greeks, there were these romantic, amorous relationships between older men and young men, right? They describe as just having their beard come in and so on, right? I think it's kind of like boring to like be like, ew, isn't this gross or isn't this ugly or something like that, right? Why is it boring? Well, there's not any ancient Greeks now, right? It's not like it's a live problem, like we need to go protect these children or something like that. Like we're talking about events that were 2,000 years old, right? And it's, kind of revealing about our own disposition towards love and sex and sexuality, that we, now like have this totally different relationship to it, right? We don't think about love and sex and so on in terms of virtue, but we think about love and sex and so on in terms of health, in terms of consent, and we use these more scientific categories to think about sexuality, right? So that's just to say, that very much exists. It makes the fact that The person who taught Socrates love is a woman, even more striking than it would have been otherwise, right? You might have expected like an older man to have taught Socrates what love is, but in this case, we have an instance of heterosexual love, right? Um, Even though there is this kind of love triangle that takes place between Agathon, Socrates, and Alcibiades, right? At one point, they're all like sitting on a couch together, drinking, and so on, right? Um, Interesting, right? So what I want to try to do for the rest of this video is try to talk about what it is that Diotima's wisdom really is, right? What is Diotima's wisdom, and how is it that it fits into the rest of the Platonic system, right? So let's start off with this first quote in this first row to the right. It is Socrates questioning Agathon, and he asks Agathon, is love such as to be love of something or nothing, right? And so his basic question is, does love aim at something, right? What is the goal? What is the desire? What is the orientation for love? And it's going to turn out that the answer to this question is very important, right? Because the way that Agathon answers is that love is, as such, to be a lover of something, right? So love seeks after something, right? Love needs something. And Socrates, naturally concludes, okay, well, if love needs something, then it doesn't have the thing that it needs, right? And so, Socrates floats this characterization of love. He says love would have to be a desire for beauty and never ugliness, right? So you might think about beauty, as being the desire for love taken in its various senses, right? And this naturally leads to Diotima's construal of love as a spirit, right? And this can be kind of hard to understand what exactly she means, right? And what she means is that love brings you from paying attention to particulars in the material world. It leads you to a contemplation of the forms, right? So spirits are ontological entities. Ontological just means what is, right? So spirits are entities that exist between the material realm and the eternal realm, the realm of the gods, and so on, right? And so when everyone previously was like praising love, for example, they were praising love as a god, right? But part of Diotima's point is, well, love is a kind of need, right? If you're a god, at least maybe on Plato's conception of what a god is, then you need for nothing, right? And so love necessarily belongs to an intermediary dimension between the mortal and the immortal worlds, right? One thing that Socrates really liked about what Agathon had to say is Agathon started out his speech by saying, hey, everyone up to this point has only really talked about qualities or characteristics of love, but they haven't really given fully fleshed out account of what love actually is. Socrates thinks this is a very good point, right? But Agathon too hasn't given an exact characterization of love, right? And so all of these men, right, they go around and they're listing all of these qualities of love, right? And what Diotima has to say to them is, and here again the gendered commentary is quite interesting. She says, quote, on the basis of what you say, I conclude you thought love was being loved rather than being a lover, right? So all of these qualities, qualities and characteristics that people use to praise love, these are relevant insofar as you are the object of love, right? But if you start to think about love as an activity, then love as an activity has an end, an aim, a goal, right? And what Diotima's wisdom involves is attuning us in some way to the end, the purpose, the what we might call the telos, right? That's like a purpose, the goal of love, right? Is, as we said, beauty, right? Beauty is the desire of love. Now, what Diotima then says is, okay, well, now we're looking at things, we're not just like offering praise of love generally, like how great it feels to be loved or something like that, right? But instead, we're thinking about the experience of being a lover, right? And what Diotima has to say about this is that the lover should realize that the beauty of any one body is beauty, or excuse me, is brother to the beauty of any other, right? And so this was what I was kind of meaning before, right? So when you are truly in love with someone, right? It's your love doesn't just attach to the particularity of that person. Otherwise, they wouldn't need to be beautiful to be loved, right? And so what you're aiming towards is not the particular thing that would maybe satisfy your desire in the material world, but what you're really craving is a kind of beauty that exceeds this, right? Diotima says, in a way, that everyone is pregnant. Everyone desires to be everlasting in some respect, right? Everyone desires a kind of immortality. And the way the animals, for example, exemplify this desire is through natural reproduction, hence the relationship between beauty and sex, right? But the experience of beauty, when you're not just experiencing what Diotima calls pregnancy of your body, right? Like you're not just trying to get off, but you're genuinely in love, right? Then what you love is not just the body of this other person insofar as it can suit your, erotic, amorous, whatever needs, but you love their soul. And in loving their soul, you want their soul to prosper, and therefore you exhibit a kind of love for the forms. You have a love of goodness, you have a love of virtue, you have a love of beauty. And your love of this one person is just an expression or a manifestation of this love of the virtues generally, right? And so Diotima says, number 5 here we have the explicit connection to the theory of forms. She says, when he, the lover, looks at beauty in the only way that beauty can be seen, then only then will it be possible for him to give birth not to images of virtue, because he is in touch with no images, but to true virtue, because he was in love or in touch with true beauty, right? And so when we love someone for merely physical, amorous reasons, right? We are, in a way, imitating true love, right? The way that someone might love someone else's soul, I imitate that, but I only love their body, right? And hence, these forms of love, these sort of like, you might say earthly, sexual, amorous kinds of love, give birth to images of virtue, right? They are a reflection, maybe, of virtue. They are a silly parody of virtue, right? But once you realize that you don't just love this image, but you love virtue itself, then you're no longer trying to see beauty, but you're trying to understand the form of beauty. And that's what leads, Diotima concludes, to true virtue. Now, that is Diotima's wisdom. There's much more to say dramatically about the dialogue. There's much more to say, for example, about Alcibiades' speech following Socrates recounting Diotima's wisdom. However, I will leave that for you all in your discussion posts. I hope that you found this video helpful. I'm very interested in reading what you think about Plato's Symposium, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.